Okay, public opinion. If you grew up in East Germany, you would be more likely to support what we call big government or socialism, quote unquote. More of socialism. More spending on social services, more central planning, that kind of stuff, if you lived in East Germany than if you lived in West Germany. Why is that? Well, because that's what you lived under, right? And that's kind of how public opinion works. When the Bush tax cuts were first introduced, they were generally opposed, but now they're generally supported, as evidenced by the fact that when Barack Obama extended the Bush tax cuts, he had a pop up in his approval rating. The general population doesn't like the way the tax cuts are weighted, but overall opinions on the Bush tax cuts are favorable. When Social Security was first implemented, it was generally unpopular. Now it's untouchable. I believe Medicare was the same way. And this thing about the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, it's unpopular now, but it'll be popular once it's implemented. And the reason it'll be popular once it's implemented is because it is in fact a government program. If it were repealed, then its repealing would be popular, right? Because the general public tends to support that which is, right? And that's pretty sad and it's pretty stupid, but that's just how people are. They tend to support that which exists. Why do they support what exists? Well, because that's what they live under, that's what they know. If North and South Korea were unified, the North Koreans would be the more statist people there. Even though they experienced all the horrors of statism, they would generally be a bit more statist than the South Koreans because that's what they lived under, right? So I'm thinking about people who say that, I'm like the Nazis. Or people like me are what gave rise to the Nazis and stuff. And well, let's just step back a little bit and let's think about, did the Nazis achieve majority support? Yes. Do my views have majority support? No. Well, that's one key difference, and I think that's a difference in personality, because people who were zealots for the Nazi Party were zealots for the status quo, because the Nazi Party became, once they gained power, they became the status quo. So zealots for the Nazi Party were zealots for the power structure. They were zealots for the state, and they were zealots for the status quo, as I said. So I believe that there is a profound psychological difference between zealots for the status quo and people who have less authoritative views on knowledge and less authoritative views on truth. Found some people say, well, it's got to be in this or that journal, this university. For example, Philippe Rushton citing Penthouse. Now, to someone with a highly authoritarian view of knowledge, like Big Lundy, or the Skeptical Heretic, or Sophia Room, people who have a highly authoritarian view of knowledge will say, you can't cite Penthouse. I look at that and I go, why? Is what Penthouse said wrong? Right? And people who don't have an authoritarian view of knowledge recognize that knowledge can come from anywhere, but people with an authoritarian view of knowledge believe that the truth has to come from certain prescribed sources. In the Middle Ages, it was the church. Nowadays, it's the universities, which of course grew out of the church. Kind of the same kind of people, and so there's a I would say a innate personality predisposition similarity there, and also an institutional outgrowth similarity there. Right? It's just more of the same. Back to the Nazis. Now, so zealots for the status quo were the kinds of people who supported the Nazi Party. And so if we look at SS fanatics, we could say that SS fanatics would probably be zealots for the status quo. They're not rebels. They're not radicals. They weren't Nazis before the Nazis became popular. Okay, they became Nazis after the Nazis became popular, right? So, another thing to consider is that Nazi racial views were out of sync with the the problem is I don't know that much about about racial hereditarianism prior to 1980 or prior to the bell curve, really. But I do know that Charles Darwin did not hold Hitler's views on the Slavs, for example. And that's mainly what we're talking about. We're mainly talking about Hitler's views on kind of a European racial hierarchy. A little bit fuzzy is what he thought once he got away from Europe. I know he considered the Japanese honorary Aryans, but the thing is, Hitler would take strong distinctions between, say, the Japanese and the Chinese, between the Japanese as superior racially to the Chinese. A strong distinction between the German and the Pole, or the German and the Slav. And what I believe this came from was Hitler's lack of an economic ideology. And if you read Hitler's writing, he will say that he lacks any real economic views whatsoever. So in terms of his economic views, he was kind of, whatever would win him elections. I don't think he had any economic views, period. He would say that he supported kind of a certain amount of socialism because that was kind of in vogue in Germany at the time. But other than that, he didn't really have any economic views. But this led to a problem in terms of analyzing why different countries had different outcomes. If economic system can't explain it, then what explains it? Well, he would ascribe it to a racial disparity. For example, he'd look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire and he would look at, the Austrian areas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire are wealthier than the Serbian areas or the Croatian areas or the Slovakian areas. Why would that be? And he would attribute it to a racial distinction as opposed to economic policy differences. So he had a profound undervaluing of the importance of economic policy, I believe Hitler did. So, we must ask the question, what would someone like me be like if I was around in Germany at the time? I think that I would be profoundly skeptical of the notion that the Pole was substantially different from the German, because if I was because now today I'm into a little bit of racial hereditarianism, but if I was into racial hereditarianism back then, I'd have less material to work with, obviously. But the old racialists back then, I believe, held that the Germans and the Poles were pretty close to each other, evolutionarily, so to speak. They hadn't discovered the double helix yet, and they didn't really know quite what genes were, but I think they had the idea that Poles and Germans were fairly closely related, being right next to each other and looking and being indistinguishable on a superficial level. Okay. So I would be profoundly, so if I were a racial hereditarian like I am in this life, if I was placed back then I would be profoundly skeptical of Nazi racial theories, and especially racial theories that castigate Slavs as subhumans. I would be very concerned about that. I'd also be very concerned about the notion of an Aryan race that originated in Central Asia, oddly enough. Because there's just no evidence for that. In fact, people at the time were saying that is totally bogus and there's no evidence for it. Now we really know there's no evidence, but people at the time were saying it's totally bogus and there's no evidence for that. Okay? So that was a bogus idea. Also, Hitler's economic policies. I would be a bit more skeptical about the propaganda, about the economic miracle of Nazi Germany, when real wages had actually fallen under Hitler's reign. What happened was there were a bunch of foreign loans taken from countries that Hitler later went to war with, and these loans were never paid off. But the problem is these loans were not used to produce goods and services and materials that people would use in their day-to-day lives. They were used to produce war stuff. They were used to basically create the German military, which other states had developed over 10, 20 years, in about 3 years. And as a result, resources were going to weaponry, and real wages did not grow up despite full employment. Real production of goods and services, consumer goods and services, did not go up. And so the average standard of living stagnated. They actually got spread around a little bit because money was going to people who were producing these guns, but then they would spend the money on basically the same supply of foods and stuff like that. And of course, as a result of this rapid buildup of the military, the German military was more modern. right? It had less obsolete equipment because it was built up over a shorter period of time, whereas the French and the British military had a lot more obsolete equipment because it was built up over a much longer period of time. And actually, the construction of fortifications along the Maginot Line was actually a good way to have military investments that wouldn't go obsolete, because big blocks of concrete are kind of timeless. So you could make an investment in 1920, 1925, and know that that investment would still be there and still be a formidable military obstacle in the year 1940. Right, whereas a tank built in 1925 would be useless by around 1940. It's getting off topic a little bit. So, in terms of Nazi racial theory, it was at odds with the I would say the Darwinian or Galtian racialists of the day. The economic policies were anti-libertarian. Ludwig von Mises fled Austria, having kind of a prediction about what would happen. Not exact prediction, but a prediction about what would happen. Ludwig von Mises, by the way, predicted the Great Depression in the United States to the month. Predicted it would be in October of 1929. Anyway, so if I was back then, well, we could look at libertarian and racial hereditarian views, right? Economic views would be out of line with Nazi economic ideology. The racial views would be out of line with Nazi racial ideology. And I, being having nonconformist views today in the United States today, well, I'm of the opinion that personalities are largely fixed, that personality is largely an inert thing, and most of the variance we see in personality is largely a result of genetics. And twin studies tend to support this. You could say, well, there are problems with twin studies. Sure, there's problems with twin studies, but those problems aside, they do lend credence to the idea that personalities are more of a natural thing, not a nurtural thing. So the kinds of people who are zealots for the status quo today, if they were in Nazi Germany in the 1940s and 30s and 40s, they would probably be zealots for that status quo. If the skeptical heretic, cardinal virtues, Big Lundy, if they were around in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, they'd be... I don't know if they joined the SS. I mean, that would involve kind of a commitment to getting killed. But they'd be Nazi Party hacks. They'd be citing the universities at the time, which of course went along with the Nazi Party. Just like they go along with the status quo now, and just like the kinds of people who do support the status quo in Germany at that time did with the Nazi Party. People you wouldn't even expect, big businessmen, business people, scientists, doctors, people who you think could think for themselves, they went along with the status quo as well, right? And they're conformists. People conform to the status quo, right? So that's what would have happened. Right? And I think it's pretty... I find it just really odd how people would say that I'm like the Nazis, or that people who hold heterodox views on race, i.e. evolutionary views on race, or hold free market economic views, which doubly bizarre, would support the... would be, if we were around back then, would be supporters of the Nazi regime. Hitler was the biggest anti-white race hater on the planet. He's responsible for the deaths of more white people than anyone on the planet and anyone in history. He called for the deaths of more white people than whatever. And I'm into historical revisionism because I like truth, especially politically incorrect truth. But make no mistake, the Nazi regime was a very anti-white regime. It brought on the second great European Civil War this century. Horrible war, horrible death of great people, great, relatively speaking, compared to other people around the world. War is inherently dysgenic. The best and the bravest tend to die off, and that's Hitler's legacy. and that's what Hitler did, and it was not a good thing, and it killed a lot of white people, right? So that's what I have to say about that. Zealots for the status quo would have been Nazis back when Nazis were popular. I don't know why this is even particularly debated. It seems super duper obvious to me. So